When Ethan Carter, a young black man with a disability, decided to fight for the home his late parents left him, the HOA Karen thought he didn't stand a chance. They set him up, forged evidence, and used every trick in the book to force him out. But what they didn't know? Ethan had a plan, one that would turn the entire case upside down. Can he outsmart the corrupt HOA and keep his family's home? If you've ever seen someone in power try to crush the little guy, hit that like button and share this story. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful tales of justice and resilience. Now, let's rewind to where it all began, the moment Ethan's world turned upside down, and the HOA thought they had him trapped. The courtroom air was thick, heavy with expectation, the kind of silence that stretched just a little too long, the kind that made people shift in their seats, waiting for the inevitable. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of crutches against the polished floor cut through the quiet as Ethan Carter made his way to the defendant's table. 19 years old, black, disabled, alone. At least that's what they thought. Across the room, Garrett Caldwell, the HOA's lead attorney, leaned back in his chair, exuding effortless confidence. He adjusted the cuffs of his pristine tailored suit and exchanged a knowing glance with Arthur Holloway, the HOA president, who sat in the front row, arms folded, a smug smirk playing at the corner of his lips. To them, this wasn't a trial, it was a formality, a showcase of their power. Garrett let out a slow, exaggerated sigh, tapping his fingers lazily against the polished oak table. His tone was dripping with amusement as he turned to the judge. "Your Honor, let's not waste time. We all know how this is going to end." A chuckle rippled through the HOA's side of the room. Someone shook their head in mock pity. Even a jury member cast Ethan a quick, uncertain glance, as if already mourning the outcome. But Ethan? He didn't flinch. He didn't react to the condescension, the laughter, or the weight of expectation pressing down on him. He just adjusted his stance, exhaled slowly, and gripped his crutches a little tighter. They thought this was already over. They thought he was exactly what he appeared to be, just a kid, out of his depth. They had no idea. They had already lost. They just didn't know it yet. But this moment, this trial, wasn't where Ethan's fight began. No, the real battle started long before this day, on the night his world came crashing down. It was supposed to be just another drive home. The rain had come down in steady sheets that evening, painting the roads in shimmering streaks of light. Inside the Carter family's old sedan, the air had been warm, filled with quiet laughter and the soft hum of a jazz station playing on the radio. Ethan had been in the back seat, watching the raindrops race each other down the window, listening as his mother playfully scolded his father for missing a turn. Again. "Frank, I swear, you've lived here for years, and you still can't remember the right exit." His father had just chuckled, shaking his head. "It's called scenic driving, darling." Ethan had smiled. It was one of those small, fleeting moments of normalcy, one of the last ones he would ever have. Because then, blinding headlights, screeching tires, metal against metal. The impact came so fast, so violently, that for a split second there was nothing. Just silence. A terrible hollow silence. And then came the pain. A crushing weight on his chest. The coppery taste of blood in his mouth. The warped, shattered remains of the car pressing in around him. Somewhere, muffled voices shouting, sirens wailing. Ethan tried to call out, tried to move, but his body refused. Then, darkness. The next thing he remembered was waking up in a hospital bed, the sterile scent of antiseptic stinging his nose. His body felt like it had been shattered and put back together the wrong way. His legs wouldn't move. A nurse had been standing beside him, her expression carefully measured. "Sweetheart, I need you to listen to me, okay?" A pause, a tightening in her jaw, then the words that ripped his world apart. "Your parents didn't make it." Nothing in the world could have prepared him for that moment. He had always known his parents weren't rich. They had worked hard, scraping by paycheck to paycheck, making sacrifices to build a life, a home, for their family. That house was everything. His mother's favorite sunflowers blooming along the front porch. The scuff marks on the kitchen floor where he and his dad used to play wrestle. The sound of jazz filling the living room on Sunday mornings while his mom cooked breakfast. That house wasn't just walls and a roof. It was memories. It was them. And now it was all he had left. But Ethan wasn't the only one who had been waiting for that inheritance. Because while he was still lying in a hospital bed, struggling to process his loss, the HOA had already begun circling like vultures. They had been waiting for this. Waiting for the moment when his parents were gone. Waiting for the perfect time to strike. They came dressed in politeness. The first time Arthur Holloway knocked on Ethan's door, he had the same warm smile he had worn at the funeral, the same condescending tilt of his head, the same syrupy voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "Ethan, my boy, I just wanted to stop by and see how you're holding up." It was the kind of concern that felt rehearsed, too polished, too perfect. Ethan, still adjusting to life without his parents, nodded stiffly. He didn't trust it. Not entirely. But Arthur was a longtime neighbor, a familiar face, someone his parents had spoken about with a certain level of respect. So when Arthur patted his shoulder and said, "If you ever need anything, son, just let me know," Ethan wanted to believe it was genuine. He would learn soon enough. It wasn't. Arthur didn't come alone the next time. He brought Garrett Caldwell, the HOA's prized attack dog. Garrett had the kind of presence that filled a room before he even stepped inside. Sharp suit, sharper eyes. The type of man who had spent years perfecting the art of the calculated smirk, just enough to be dismissive but not enough to be outright rude. "Ethan, I'm sure you understand how important it is to maintain community standards." That was the first red flag. The second came when Arthur, still keeping up his grandfatherly facade, pulled out a folder. "There's just a little issue with your property lines," he said, almost apologetically. Ethan took the folder, flipping through its neatly printed pages, maps, measurements, official-looking documents. And then he saw it. The fence line. It had been moved, by inches at first, barely noticeable. But in the grand scheme of things, those inches meant a significant portion of his backyard was no longer his. "This has to be a mistake," Ethan said, shaking his head. Arthur sighed, placing a hand over his heart, as if this pained him. "I know, son, I know. But the association recently reviewed all property boundaries, and, well, the records show your parents' fence was slightly encroaching onto HOA property." Ethan's hands clenched. That was a lie. His parents had owned this house for over 15 years. If there had been an issue with the property line, it would have been brought up long before now. He could feel the weight of Garrett's stare, studying him like a hunter watching prey. "These things happen," Garrett interjected smoothly. "Luckily, we're more than willing to work with you on resolving it." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "And if I don't agree?" The smile never left Garrett's face. "Then you'll be in violation of HOA guidelines." It was a warning wrapped in politeness. A few inches today. A legal battle tomorrow. They weren't offering to work with him. They were telling him exactly how this was going to go. And that was only the beginning. The letters started coming 2 weeks later. At first they were small fines, $50 for unapproved landscaping changes. Then $200 for excessive wear and tear on the driveway. Then $500 for installing a wheelchair ramp without HOA authorization. That one nearly made Ethan laugh. His parents had built the ramp years ago after his first surgery. But now, apparently, it was a violation. Every fine came with a deadline. Every deadline came with a threat of additional penalties. And just like that, the debt started to pile up. HOA wasn't trying to fine him into compliance. They were trying to fine him out of his home. Then came the real attack. Arthur returned one last time, this time with a new proposal. "Listen, Ethan, I know this must feel overwhelming," he sighed, shaking his head. "You're a young man, still getting on your feet. This house, it's a big responsibility. We're willing to help you out." He slid a purchase offer across the table. They wanted him to sell. For a fraction of what the house was worth. They wanted his home. Ethan stared at the papers, at Arthur's expectant expression, at Garrett standing just behind him, arms crossed, amusement flickering in his cold blue eyes. This was never about violations. This was about taking what they had always wanted. This wasn't just a financial attack. It was a calculated move to erase him from the neighborhood completely. They thought he would fold. They thought he had nowhere to turn, no one to fight for him. They thought he would give up. But Ethan Carter wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Silence. It wasn't the kind that brought peace. It was the kind that crept into every corner of Ethan's house, stretching through the empty hallways, curling up in the spaces where his parents used to be. It was the kind of silence that screamed the truth no one wanted to say out loud. He was alone. The first time Ethan knocked on his neighbor's door, he still had hope. Mrs. Callahan had known his mother for years. They had swapped recipes, shared garden tools, laughed together on warm summer evenings. When Ethan was younger, she had even babysat him a few times. So when the fines started piling up, when the HOA's threats became too much, Ethan thought, maybe she'll help me. He knocked once, twice. He heard movement inside, a pause, a hesitation, and then nothing. A full minute passed before the locks clicked. The door opened just an inch, the chain still latched. "Ethan," she said, her voice careful, guarded. "Sweetheart, She glanced over her shoulder. Ethan didn't need to see past the door to know what she was looking at. "Mrs. Callahan, please. You know this isn't right." She flinched. She stopped herself. "I have grandkids to think about, honey." And just like that, the door closed. Click. Locked again. Ethan stood there for a long time, staring at the peeling paint on the doorframe. She hadn't even said she was sorry. It was the same everywhere he turned. The neighbors who had once smiled at his parents now avoided his eyes. The people who had comforted him at the funeral now barely acknowledged him at all. And the worst part? The ones who didn't pretend to care. Like Mr. Latham, the man 2 doors down, who muttered just loud enough for Ethan to hear, "Some people just don't belong here." That one stuck with him. It wasn't just about the fines, the money, the so-called violations. It was about him. They never wanted him here. They never wanted his family here. That night, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring at the final warning notice from the HOA. A thick, official-looking envelope sat next to it, their offer to buy his house. The numbers printed on the page were almost laughable. They thought they had him backed into a corner. They thought he had no way out. And for a moment, a single, painful moment, Ethan almost believed them. He gripped the arms of his wheelchair, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. Then his eyes drifted across the room, to the old record player in the corner, the one his father used to play every Sunday morning, to the scuff marks on the hardwood floor, memories of dancing feet, of laughter, of love, to the worn-out armchair by the window, his mother's favorite reading spot, the pages of her last book still dog-eared. This wasn't just a house. This was his home. And they would have to rip it from his hands before he gave it up willingly. With steady determination, Ethan pushed the envelope aside. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. The courtroom air was thick with certainty, the kind that came before an inevitable conclusion. Or at least, that's what everyone else thought. Ethan Carter rolled into the room, his movements deliberate, steady. The wheels of his chair glided over the polished floor, the rhythmic sound filling the silence as he made his way to the defendant's table. Every gaze followed him, some curious, some amused, most of them pitying. Across the aisle, Garrett Caldwell didn't even bother to hide his smirk. He sat relaxed, exuding the confidence of a man who had seen this play out too many times before. He didn't even stand when Ethan settled into place. Instead, he turned to the judge, his fingers tapping lazily on the table, and let out a slow, exaggerated sigh. "Your Honor, really?" he drawled, voice dripping with amusement. "We're allowing a 19-year-old, without legal representation, to argue his own case? This isn't a school debate tournament." A soft murmur rippled through the courtroom. A few people chuckled under their breath. The judge, Malcolm Reeves, didn't react right away. Instead, he studied Ethan, his sharp gaze scanning the young man in front of him. He had seen plenty of defendants over the years, the desperate, the defeated, the ones who knew they had no chance. But something about this kid was different. There was no panic, no uncertainty, just stillness. Judge Reeves leaned forward slightly, lacing his fingers together. "Mr. Carter, do you understand that by representing yourself, you waive your right to an attorney?" Ethan nodded. "I do, Your Honor." A brief pause. The judge hesitated just for a second before giving a slow nod. Garrett noticed, and for a fleeting moment, something in his smirk wavered, just slightly. But he recovered fast. Too fast. Arthur Holloway sat in the front row, arms crossed, watching the proceedings like a man who had already seen the final score. Because he had. This wasn't new. He had seen single mothers, retirees, veterans, all of them crushed under the weight of legal fees and endless fines. He had watched people fight, struggle, beg, and still lose. Ethan Carter was no different. Young, alone, a kid with no lawyer, no resources, no chance. Holloway barely spared him a glance before turning to his phone, scrolling like he had somewhere better to be. Garrett, meanwhile, leaned back in his chair, shaking his head as if he actually pitied Ethan. "Listen, kid," he said, voice smooth, almost patient. "I'll give you credit. You've got guts." He shrugged, spreading his hands in a display of false generosity. "But let's be honest. We both know how this is going to end, and I'd really hate for you to embarrass yourself." The laughter from the HOA's side was quiet but undeniable. Ethan didn't react. Not to the words. Not to the smirks. Not to the expectation pressing down on him from every corner of the room. He simply adjusted his posture, folded his hands in front of him, and held Garrett's gaze. There was something in Ethan's eyes, something Garrett hadn't expected. It wasn't fear, it wasn't uncertainty. It was patience. Like someone waiting for the storm to come, because they already knew how to weather it. And for the first time, Garrett felt something foreign and unfamiliar creep into his gut. Doubt. They had written the script. They had set the stage. But what they didn't know, Ethan had just flipped to an entirely different playbook. For a long moment, the courtroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that came from respect, but the kind that came from expectation, from certainty, from the assumption that this was going to be over quickly. Garrett Caldwell had seen it too many times before. The nervous stammering, the scrambling for words, the desperate last-minute attempt to find a loophole that didn't exist. And when that didn't work, the inevitable surrender. But Ethan Carter didn't stammer, didn't scramble, didn't look the least bit desperate. Instead, he reached into his bag, pulled out a single document, and placed it on the table in front of him. A simple, folded piece of paper. Garrett's smirk faltered, just for a second. Ethan took his time unfolding it, smoothing the edges carefully before sliding it across the table toward the judge. "Your Honor," Ethan said, his voice steady, even. "Before we proceed, I'd like to submit this as evidence." Judge Reeves took the document, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the page. The room held its breath. Then, a flicker, a barely noticeable shift in the judge's posture. He leaned forward, reading more carefully. And that was when Garrett knew something was wrong. Garrett cleared his throat, still relaxed, still composed. "Mr. Carter, would you mind explaining what exactly you've just submitted?" Ethan didn't rush, didn't fumble. Instead, he folded his hands neatly in front of him and spoke with the same calm precision he had carried since the moment he entered the room. "This is an independent land survey conducted 2 months ago by a certified professional, completely unaffiliated with the HOA." Garrett's smirk was still there, but his fingers twitched against the table. "And what exactly does this prove?" Ethan turned his head, looking directly at him now. "It proves that the HOA moved the property line illegally." The room shifted. Not physically, but emotionally. Like a collective realization had just settled over everyone at once. The jury members exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery whispered something under their breath. Judge Reeves frowned, looking back down at the survey. "Mr. Carter, are you saying the HOA knowingly altered the property boundaries?" Ethan didn't blink. "I'm not saying anything, Your Honor. The evidence is..." Garrett let out a breathy chuckle, shaking his head like Ethan had just said something ridiculous. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is irrelevant. The HOA's mapping system is in line with county records." "Actually," Ethan interrupted smoothly, "it's not." Garrett stopped mid-sentence. Ethan reached for another sheet of paper, this one printed from the county's own records. "This is the official boundary map from 2 years ago, directly from county archives. It shows the original fence line, before the HOA made its adjustments." He set it down next to the land survey. "And this," he continued, producing another document, "is a record of the HOA's new property line." He placed it beside the others. "Compare them." Judge Reeves did. The moment his eyes landed on the discrepancies, his brow furrowed. That was when the real silence fell over the courtroom. This time it wasn't filled with expectation. It was filled with realization. For the first time since the trial began, Garrett Caldwell hesitated. It was small, a fraction of a second. But Ethan saw it. So did the judge, so did the jury. The momentum in the room had shifted, and Garrett knew it. He exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders back. But he wasn't done yet. No, he still had another card to play. A bigger one. And as he sat up straighter, regaining his composure, he forced a slow smirk back onto his face. "That's cute, kid." His tone was smooth again, controlled. "But if you think that's enough to win this case, you clearly don't understand how this game is played." Ethan didn't react, didn't flinch. Because unlike Garrett, he wasn't bluffing. And the game, it had only just begun. For a moment, the courtroom had been on Ethan's side. The independent land survey, the county records, everything pointed to the truth. Garrett Caldwell had lost his smirk, the judge had furrowed his brows, and the jury had begun shifting in their seats, whispering to one another. Ethan had them. And then, Garrett smiled. Not a forced, nervous smile. Not the strained, thin-lipped smirk he had been barely holding onto since Ethan exposed the HOA's fraudulent land grab. No, this was a real smile. The kind that said, "You poor, stupid kid." And that was when Ethan knew. Something was coming. Something big. Garrett moved slowly, too slowly, as if savoring the moment. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smoother than ever. "While Mr. Carter has certainly done his research, I believe he's overlooked one crucial detail." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a document, neatly folded, its edges crisp and unblemished. "This," he announced, placing it on the table with a deliberate tap, "is a signed agreement from Mr. Carter himself. A legally binding document in which he consents to the updated property boundaries as per the HOA's revised community mapping." A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Reeves blinked, clearly taken aback. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears. The document was passed down the table, and when it landed in front of him, his stomach dropped. There, in bold black ink, was his name, his signature. A hushed voice from the gallery. "Wait, he signed it?" A juror, a middle-aged man with silver-rimmed glasses, leaned forward, glancing toward his colleague. Even Judge Reeves let out a low, exasperated breath, rubbing his temple as he reread the page. "And Garrett?" Garrett looked at ease for the first time all day. "As you can see," he continued, his voice carrying just the right amount of mock sympathy, "Mr. Carter did in fact approve these changes. I understand that legal matters can be overwhelming for someone his age, but unfortunately, Your Honor," he let out a dramatic sigh, "ignorance is not a valid defense in court." The jab landed, and for the first time, Ethan felt the walls closing in. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the way the jury was looking at him now, less sure, less convinced, made his stomach churn. For the first time since this trial began, Arthur Holloway looked pleased. From the front row, the HOA president leaned back in his seat, his arms crossed, watching Ethan like he was enjoying the final act of a show he had already seen before. They planned this. Ethan's breath hitched. His fingers clenched the document. The panic crept in, slow and suffocating, wrapping around his chest like an iron grip. Had he signed something? No, he was sure, wasn't he? The memory of the last meeting with the HOA flickered in his mind, the endless paperwork, the exhaustion. Could they have slipped something in? Could he have missed it? No, he couldn't have, right? And then, a memory surfaced, not of the HOA, not of this trial, but of a night long before this battle ever started. He was 10 years old, sitting at the kitchen table, watching his father go through contracts from work. He remembered the way his dad's brow furrowed, the way he would read through every line, twice, 3 times. More if he had to. "People will lie to your face," his father had said, not looking up. "But the real deception?" He tapped the papers in front of him. "It happens here, in the fine print, in the details they hope you don't check." His father had paused then, looking at him. "Never take a contract at face value, Ethan, ever." Ethan's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. He forced himself to take a slow breath, gripping the edge of the table until his fingers ached. And then his father's voice came back to him. The doubt, gone. The panic, dissolved. Ethan lifted his gaze, met Garrett's eyes, and smiled. It was small, almost imperceptible, but Garrett saw it, and suddenly, his confidence didn't feel so certain anymore. Ethan exhaled slowly, calm now. Because now he knew exactly what to do. And the best part? Garrett had just given him everything he needed to win. The courthouse doors swung shut behind Ethan, sealing the weight of the trial inside. The crisp autumn air should have felt refreshing. It didn't. His hands clenched against the wheels of his chair as he made his way down the courthouse steps, his mind still trapped in the suffocating walls of that courtroom. Garrett's voice echoed in his head. Mr. Carter did, in fact, approve these changes. The jury's hesitation, the whispers, the shift in their eyes, one that said, maybe this kid isn't as innocent as we thought. It had been a perfect trap, and for the first time since this war began, Ethan felt the creeping, sickening possibility of defeat. They had played their hand, and it was a damn good one. The house felt different when he rolled inside. Too quiet, too still. It wasn't just the silence, it was the absence. The absence of his father's low hum as he read through legal briefs at the dining table. The absence of his mother's soft laughter drifting in from the kitchen. Their presence had once filled this space, made it warm, made it safe. Now it was just Ethan. Alone. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Think, Ethan. He knew that document was fake, but knowing wasn't enough. He had to prove it. And in a courtroom, proof was the only thing that mattered. His eyes drifted toward the study, his father's old workspace, untouched since the accident. Something pulled him toward it. The wooden desk was exactly as his father had left it. Papers stacked neatly, legal pads filled with notes, law books worn from years of use. Ethan ran his fingers along the edge of the desk, swallowing the lump in his throat. Then, he opened the top drawer. Inside, buried beneath years of old case files and legal paperwork, was a worn, leather-bound notebook. His father's handwriting scrawled across the cover in black ink. Know the rules before you play the game. Ethan hesitated. Then with careful fingers he flipped it open. Inside, page after page of legal notes, handwritten in the familiar, precise script of a man who lived in the gray areas of the law long enough to understand every loophole, every trick, every weakness. And then, there it was. A passage underlined 3 times. The law isn't about who has the most power, it's about who understands it best. Ethan's breath hitched, and then suddenly he saw it. His eyes darted back to the forged document in his hand, scanning the signature, the notary stamp, the formatting, and then it hit him like a freight train. The mistake. The one thing Garrett and the HOA overlooked. His pulse pounded. This was it. The crack in their perfect lie. They had no idea. But tomorrow, they were going to find out. The next day, Ethan returns to court, ready to strike back. The courthouse looked the same. Same polished floors, same heavy wooden doors, same rows of seats filled with HOA board members waiting to watch him lose. But something was different. Ethan was different. Yesterday, he had walked into this room, underestimating just how far the HOA would go to win. That wouldn't happen again. This time, he wasn't just defending himself. This time, he was on the attack. Garrett Caldwell sat at the HOA's table, relaxed, confident, too confident. He didn't even look up when Ethan rolled in. He was busy adjusting his tie, tapping a pen against the table, like this was just another routine case he was about to win. Arthur Holloway, seated beside him, leaned over and muttered something under his breath. Garrett chuckled. They were already celebrating. They thought yesterday had been Ethan's last chance, that he had gone home defeated. That today was just a formality, a final nail in the coffin before they walked out of here with his house in their hands. They had no idea. Judge Reeves entered. The courtroom settled. Mr. Carter, the judge began, adjusting his glasses. You requested to submit new evidence today. Proceed. Ethan nodded. He didn't rush. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out 2 documents. One was the HOA's so-called agreement, the one with his supposed signature. The other, his actual signature from a legal form he had signed months earlier. He placed them side by side on the evidence table. Your Honor, Ethan began, his voice steady, yesterday, the HOA presented this contract claiming that I willingly agreed to their property line changes. He turned to the jury, making sure they could all see the papers before them. There's just one problem. A pause. I never signed it. Garrett's smirk didn't falter. Not yet, but Ethan saw it. That tiny shift in his expression. That flicker of doubt. The HOA lawyer let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head as if Ethan was nothing more than a clueless child grasping at straws. Mr. Carter, Garrett said smoothly, forgery is a serious accusation. If you're implying that this signature isn't yours, I hope you have real proof. Ethan turned back to the judge. I do, Your Honor. He took a laser pointer from his pocket, clicked it on, and pointed to the signature on the HOA's document. This is the signature the HOA claims is mine. Then he shifted the pointer to the other document, the one he actually signed months ago. And this is my actual signature. He leaned back, letting the jury see the comparison for themselves. Even at a glance, the differences were obvious. The curve of the letters, the angle of the slant, the pressure on the strokes. One was smooth, natural, his own. The other, a forced imitation. A forgery. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Ethan glanced at the judge, who was leaning forward now, scrutinizing the documents. Garrett opened his mouth, but before he could speak, "Your Honor," Ethan continued, cutting him off, "if needed, I'm happy to request a forensic handwriting analyst to verify these signatures. But I think you can already see the truth." The murmurs grew louder. Garrett straightened in his seat, his fingers curled slightly against the table. Ethan saw it, the first sign of real discomfort. But he wasn't done yet, not even close. "But that's not all," Ethan continued, keeping his tone calm, measured. "Even if the HOA claims I signed this, there's another issue with this contract." He picked up the document, turned it to the bottom of the page, and pointed to a tiny detail. The notary's stamp. The judge's brows furrowed. "What about it?" Ethan turned back to Garrett now. This time he was the one smiling. "The date, Your Honor." A pause. "The HOA claims I signed this agreement voluntarily." Another pause. "But the notary's timestamp is dated 2 weeks after my parents died." The air in the room shifted. Not just surprise, but realization. A trap had just snapped shut. The judge took the paper from Ethan's hands, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the page. The jury was whispering now, leaning in, reading the numbers for themselves. Garrett's jaw tensed. Arthur Holloway, who had been sitting so smugly in the front row, suddenly looked pale. "Which means," Ethan continued, his voice clear, strong, unshaken, "either I somehow signed a legal document 2 weeks after burying my parents." He let the words hang. Or he turned back to Garrett, locking eyes. Or this contract was created after the fact, which would mean it's fake. Silence. Not the casual kind. Not the "we're just waiting for the next part of the trial" kind. This was heavy. Uncomfortable, because for the first time since this trial began, the HOA was on the defensive. Garrett cleared his throat, straightened his tie. "Your Honor, if I could just—" "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Reeves interrupted, his voice sharper now, "do you have an immediate explanation for this discrepancy?" The entire courtroom turned to Garrett. He opened his mouth, then closed it. His face was still composed, but his fingers twitched against the table. And Ethan just watched him, waiting. Because for the first time, Garrett had no script to follow. No smug remarks, no smooth, pre-planned counters. Just the weight of his own deception, unraveling in real time. Ethan folded his hands together, keeping his expression neutral. But inside, he knew. The game had just changed. And this time, he was the one holding all the cards. The courtroom was still reeling from Ethan's revelation. The forged signature, the falsified timestamp. Everything the HOA had built their case on was crumbling right in front of them. Garrett Caldwell was silent, his usual smooth confidence cracking at the edges. His fingers tapped against the table, his mind clearly racing for a way out. Arthur Holloway sat stone-faced, gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The jury? They weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting. Because for the first time since this trial began, it wasn't Ethan who was on the ropes. It was the HOA. Then, a voice from the back of the room. "Your Honor, if I may speak." Heads snapped toward the entrance. A man stood near the door, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked hair and an expensive suit that looked like it hadn't been worn in a while. His presence shifted the entire atmosphere. Arthur Holloway's face drained of color. Garrett Caldwell went rigid. And Ethan? Ethan had never seen this man before. But something about him told him he was about to change everything. Judge Reeves adjusted his glasses. "And you are?" The man stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the floor as he approached the witness stand. "Jonathan Blake, Your Honor," he said, voice steady. "Former HOA board member." A ripple of shock spread through the courtroom. Ethan felt it. The shift, the realization, the weight of what this meant. A former HOA board member? Testifying against them? Garrett stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. This witness has not been disclosed prior to today." Judge Reeves eyed him coolly. "Mr. Caldwell, sit down." Garrett hesitated. For the first time, his face showed something dangerously close to panic. But he sat. Jonathan Blake settled into the witness stand, adjusting his tie as he leaned toward the microphone. Then, "I have information relevant to this case," he said simply, "and I have the emails to prove it." The tension in the room shifted from heavy to suffocating. Arthur Holloway shook his head once, slowly, his mouth slightly open, as if in disbelief. Garrett, his jaw tightened so hard it looked like his teeth might crack. "Emails?" Judge Reeves asked, his voice calm but sharp. "What kind of emails?" Jonathan reached into his briefcase, pulled out a thick folder, and set it down on the table. "Internal HOA communications," he said. "Documents that confirm the association's plan to financially squeeze Mr. Carter out of his home." He flipped the folder open. "These emails, Your Honor, show exactly how the HOA fabricated violations, imposed excessive fines, and most importantly," he paused, looking directly at Garrett, "how they forged a legal document to push through the property boundary changes." Silence. The kind of silence that came before an explosion. Judge Reeves lifted the first page. His expression, which had been neutral all morning, darkened. Slowly he turned his attention to Garrett. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge said, his voice lower now. He wasn't asking, he was demanding. "Would you like to explain this?" Garrett didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink. Arthur Holloway looked like he had aged 10 years in the past 5 minutes. Whispers surged through the gallery, shocked, angry, disbelieving. The jury? They were no longer just watching, they were glaring. And Ethan? He sat back in his chair, watching the house of cards finally collapse. Jonathan Blake exhaled slowly, then looked at Ethan. Really looked at him. "I should have come forward sooner," he admitted, voice quieter now. "But I won't stay silent anymore." Ethan swallowed, nodded. Because for the first time in months, he wasn't standing alone. And the HOA? They were done. The weight of the courtroom had shifted. No more murmurs, no more speculation, just silence. The kind that pressed against the walls, against the people inside. The kind that came before the final blow. Judge Malcolm Reeves set the stack of incriminating emails down with deliberate care, his fingers pressing against the edges as if grounding himself against the sheer gravity of what he had just read. Then, he lifted his gaze, straight at Garrett Caldwell. "Mr. Caldwell." The judge's voice was even, controlled, but sharp as a blade. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Every eye in the courtroom turned to Garrett. His posture, so smug, so effortlessly confident just an hour ago, was now rigid. The lawyer who had spent the entire trial mocking Ethan, dismissing him, taunting him like this was just another easy case, now sat there, his jaw clenched so tight the vein in his temple was visible. For the first time, he had no answer, no counter, no loophole to slip through, nothing. Ethan watched Garrett's fingers curl into fists on the table, his breath coming just a little too fast. He was cornered, completely, utterly, defeated. Arthur Holloway, the HOA president, wasn't any better. The once powerful man, who had laughed, who had smirked, who had treated this like a mere inconvenience, now sat pale-faced, gripping the arms of his chair, like a man bracing for impact. Jonathan Blake's testimony had ripped the rug right out from under him. The emails had destroyed any plausible deniability, and now they were the ones being judged. Judge Reeves exhaled, slow and heavy. Then he picked up his gavel. "This court finds that the Homeowners Association has engaged in fraudulent and unethical practices against Mr. Carter." Arthur Holloway visibly flinched. "Furthermore," the judge continued, his gaze unwavering, "this court is filing an immediate injunction against the HOA's attempts to seize Mr. Carter's home." A pause. A sharp look at Garrett. "Additionally, the court will be referring Mr. Caldwell and the HOA board members for further investigation regarding the falsification of legal documents." Gasps erupted from the gallery. Arthur Holloway let out a sharp breath, the kind of breath a man takes when the noose tightens. "Garrett?" Garrett stared forward, expression blank, because this wasn't just a loss. This was career-ending. Judge Reeves raised the gavel, but before delivering the final ruling, he turned to Ethan. "Mr. Carter," his voice was steady, but there was a weight behind it. A pause. A moment for Ethan to take in everything that had just happened. "Do you wish to file a counterclaim against the HOA?" Ethan's fingers tightened on the wheels of his chair. A slow, steady breath. The room held still. Even the jury, who had already made up their minds about the case, leaned forward slightly, waiting. Ethan turned his head. His eyes met Garrett's. For months, he had been underestimated, mocked, pushed to the edge with every system designed to crush him. And yet, here he was. He let the silence stretch just long enough. Then, "Yes, Your Honor," Judge Reeves nodded. "Then this court grants Mr. Carter the right to sue the HOA for financial damages, attorney's fees, and emotional distress." He tapped the gavel once. "Court is adjourned." And just like that, it was over. Garrett didn't move. Arthur Holloway buried his face in his hands. The once smug HOA board members scrambled for their papers, their whispers frantic, their carefully crafted empire reduced to nothing but wreckage. The jury had stopped watching Ethan. Now they were watching Garrett. One juror, a woman in a blue blazer, shook her head before standing up to leave. Another, an older man who had looked skeptical of Ethan at first, gave a small nod before turning toward the exit. They didn't need to say anything. Their expressions said it all. And Ethan? Ethan sat there for a moment, letting it sink in, letting himself feel it. The weight that had crushed him for months? Gone. The house that was stolen piece by piece? His again. The people who had laughed at him, underestimated him, written him off? They were the ones leaving in shame. Slowly, Ethan turned. Garrett was already standing, gathering his briefcase in stiff, robotic movements. His jaw was locked, his expression a hollow mask. Ethan studied him. Then, as Garrett turned to leave, Ethan did something he hadn't planned. He leaned back in his chair, mirroring Garrett's old posture, the one Garrett had used when he was certain of victory. And then, slowly, deliberately, he smiled. Ethan rolled out of the courthouse, the crisp autumn air hitting his face as he took his first breath of freedom. Not just freedom from the HOA, but freedom from the weight of uncertainty, from the fear of losing everything. It was over. He had won. But as he sat there, staring at the sky, he realized something. This fight, it was never just about a house. He noticed them before they spoke. The neighbors. The same people who had once smiled at his parents, who had dropped off casseroles after the funeral, who had watched as the HOA came for him and said nothing. Now they stood awkwardly, shifting on their feet, their expressions a mixture of guilt and regret. Mrs. Langford, the woman who had once brought cookies to his doorstep as a child, stepped forward. "Ethan, She hesitated, eyes downcast. "We should have done more." A murmur of agreement rippled through the small crowd. Ethan held their gaze. He wanted to be angry, wanted to tell them that kind words after the battle meant nothing if you weren't there when the war began. But he didn't. Instead, he simply nodded. "Next time," he said, voice calm but firm, "help sooner." And with that, he turned away. Because he wasn't looking for apologies. He was looking forward. Near the steps of the courthouse, a man in a gray suit leaned against a pillar, watching him. Unlike the others, he didn't look guilty. He looked intrigued. As Ethan passed, the man pushed himself off the pillar and walked alongside him. "You handled yourself well in there," he said. "Not many people could tear apart a case like that, especially not without a law degree." Ethan glanced at him, studying his polished shoes, the briefcase in his hand. "Who are you?" The man smiled. "David Sinclair, attorney." He slipped a card into Ethan's hand. "And someone who thinks you should consider law school." Ethan stared at the card, the words blurring slightly as his mind raced. Law school. It wasn't something he had ever planned for. But now he wasn't so sure. Ethan turned the card over in his fingers, the weight of the past few months pressing against his chest. The fights, the fear, the injustice. His parents had always taught him to stand up for himself. But what if he could stand up for others too? He looked up, meeting David's gaze. And for the first time, he saw a future he hadn't considered before. A future where he wasn't just fighting his own battles. A future where he was fighting for people who didn't know how to fight back. He slipped the card into his pocket. Then he smiled. Because this wasn't an ending. This was a beginning. I won this battle. But how many others are out there, people just like me, being bullied, threatened, pushed out of their homes because they don't know their rights? How many more need someone to stand up for them? I won't stop here. I can't, because the system isn't broken. It's rigged. And I intend to change that. If this story moved you, even for a second, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like Ethan's aren't just fiction. They happen every day to people who don't have a voice. And if you believe in justice, in standing up for what's right, then make sure you subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories to life. And together, we can shine a light on the battles that deserve to be fought. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.